Hello and welcome back to the course Private Pilot Maneuvers. Today we'll do some short field landings. Now again, as in a short field takeoff, short is relative, of course, depending on the aircraft type, for example, that you're flying. Again, with a short runway, I mean everything that's just close to limits regarding your performance calculations. So any landing that doesn't give you much margin in terms of runway length. Also, I'm not talking about soft field landings right now. I'm just talking about short paved runways. Generally, as in short field takeoffs, it's really important that you check your performance with the pilot's operating handbook beforehand. And not only do that, but also before your landing, check if the conditions are still valid. So if it's a really short runway, it's probably a small uncontrolled field. So really overfly the runway first, or the airfield, look at the windsock, see if actually the conditions are the same. It's actually the same wind that you used for your performance calculations. Also check if the temperature is still the same with what you calculated. And the same goes, of course, for all other conditions. For example, maybe you were expecting a dry runway, but now it's wet, and so on. Especially be careful, of course, just as in the takeoffs at higher altitudes. So higher altitudes in terms of sea level, you have a higher density altitude, especially if the temperatures are abnormally warm. So really check your conditions. And if you have a high density altitude, then you will always fly at the same indicated airspeed, of course, but you will have a higher true airspeed then, and also higher ground speed. So you will come in faster, everything will be quicker, and there's much more energy to absorb during braking. So at high density altitudes, you will need more runway. Just keep that in mind, but your operating handbook should tell you so, actually. I'm giving some general information now in this briefing. Of course, you have to check your handbook of the respective airplane you're flying. Now, for example, for the Cessna 152, the final approach speed for short field landings is 54 knots at a flap setting of 30 degrees. Full flaps, obviously. Gives you the shortest landing distance. Now, speaking of approach speed, this is something that's really important. If you're coming in too fast, you will never be able to match your performance calculations. It's as simple as that. And speed has a big influence. Don't underestimate this. If you're coming in 10 knots or 10%, I'm sorry, if you're coming in 10% faster than you should, then the landing distance may be increased by up to 20%. Now, if you just imagine this, let's take easy numbers. Let's say your approach speed is 60 knots, but you're coming in on final approach with 70 knots. Then maybe you are not going to need 400 meters to land, but maybe almost 500. And this is a big difference if you're going into a field where you are limited in runway length in the first place. So if the handbook says 54 knots, you need to fly 54 knots. That's a mistake that's often made. Many pilots feel uncomfortable flying at such low speeds. If the speed is normally 60 knots and they're really uncomfortable going to 54 or 55. But it's something that can absolutely be safely done. It's a speed from the handbook and you can fly it. And if you really do this carefully, this is not a dangerous thing to do. Of course, you have to keep in mind if there's a strong and gusty wind. For example, you need to do some corrections for wind, especially gusts. This is some difficult trade-off, actually, if you're approaching a short field with strong and gusty winds. It's probably not ideal because you want to add a bit of speed to your approach speed to compensate for the gusts. That's fine, of course, but then let's assume on very short final there are no gusts whatsoever and you're coming in a few knots too fast again, so the field is too short. So you really need to know what the performance is like, especially, for example, if the handbook says your landing ground roll, so wheels on the ground until full stop, is, let's say, 250 meters, and the runway is 500 meters long, then you simply know that you need to touch down within the first half. Otherwise, it will never work. So don't be tempted to think that you can outmatch the numbers in the handbook. As a general rule, I would say with a short field, you should always touch down in the first third of the runway. If it's extremely short, of course, might be necessary to touch down earlier. So the approach speed from the handbook, let's say that's 54 knots. Actually, in theory, you need those 54 knots over the threshold, because that's the speed, that's how it's calculated. It doesn't help you at all to fly 54 knots on a 10 miles final. This won't help you with your short field performance. You can fly a 70 knots 10 miles final or 90 knots as long as you have your 54 knots just over the threshold. You should fly a stabilized approach, so don't reduce to the final approach but at the very last moment, because maybe you cannot reduce it in time. Then do it early enough. I'm just saying that there's no need to fly such as low speed 10 miles out. Then, well, the landing technique actually is normal, just as we talked about in the landing lesson. Try to make a touchdown at slow speed with the main wheels first, so nose up, then slowly lower the nose wheel. Just remember that as you're coming in slower than in a normal landing, that you probably will have to flare later. The flare will be shorter, which of course is a good thing on a short runway. Then apply brakes as required. So if it's a short runway, it doesn't mean that you have to hit the brakes very heavily immediately. If you perform a perfect touchdown at the beginning of the runway, brake as required. So if you do that perfect touchdown very early, maybe there is no need to actually hit the brakes really hard. So you can just brake gently and then vacate the runway at the end, for example. Also, don't fall for the temptation to slam the brakes and lock the wheels, because this could lead to a loss of control. Another thing that you maybe often see with bush pilots on their landings is that immediately after touchdown, they retract the flaps. This reduces your actual landing roll, of course, because it puts more weights on the wheels. The brakes will be more effective. However, I only recommend to do this on really short runways. And as a normal pilot, so to speak, if you're not proficient in really short field bush operations, it's probably not required. As a normal pilot, I'd say you probably won't go to a runway that's so short that you need all the braking you have after touchdown. And if you don't really need it, so if the runway is long enough, don't retract the flaps right away, because it's a distraction. You touch down and you reach down for that flap lever and retract the flaps. It's a distraction. You look away when actually you should look outside. And if you don't look away and do it just with your hand still looking out, then there's the danger of operating the wrong control. For example, the landing gear lever. There have been accidents actually where pilots were touching down really soft and they wanted to retract the flaps right away, but didn't look, and they retracted the gear, and it was still possible because the weight on wheel switch was not yet activated because of the very soft touchdown. So if it's not really necessary, leave the flaps alone until exiting the runway. But of course, if it's necessary, retract them. It will give you the best landing performance, the best braking performance, actually. All right. Actually, in a short field landing, there are two scenarios. let's look at the first one. As you can see in this picture here, that is, we have no obstacles in our final approach. There are no trees, buildings whatsoever. There's maybe just a field, so no obstacles. Now, actually, you have two options here in theory. You can fly, and actually that's what you should do, a stabilized approach like you can see in the image. So as we talked about it in the normal landing lesson, constant angle, constant speed, the airplane is in trim, constant rate of descent, and so on. So really nice stabilized approach at your final approach speed for short field landings. And this will work out just nicely. Now there's a second option. You could also drag it in. So you could fly a very flat approach, coming into your runway really flat, slow, nose high up. This will make it pretty easy to touch down at a specific spot very early on the runway. So you would be dragging it in at slow speed. You have high drag already, high power, and then just as you cross the threshold, you can cut the power and the airplane will settle onto the runway and you will have a very short landing. One can see people do that, and of course it gives you really short landing distance, but always ask yourself, is this really necessary? Is the field that short? As a normal private pilot, I'd say most of the fields aren't. So you can still fly your stabilized approach, and if you have your speed correct and your technique, then you will be able to do a really short landing with that method as well. So only drag it in if you really need to, if it's really that short, and just keep in mind why you shouldn't do that at all times is what if you have an engine failure. So if you're coming very low and slow and you have an engine failure, you have no time to react. You will just hit the terrain below. So this is something that you should only consider in this case that you can see in the image where you have no obstacles in the approach path. Then you can actually, well, one could say it's okay to do it because if you have then an engine failure, you just the airplane will just settle on that field, and okay, it won't be pretty, but probably will walk away. You really shouldn't drag it in over obstacles, because what if you have an engine failure over those trees? If you're coming in very low over trees and then you have an engine failure, you will for sure settle into those trees. So I'm just giving you those two options, coming in nicely stabilized, which is the preferred option anytime it's possible at all, and then dragging it in for really short runways. You see bush pilots doing that. If they're going into a very short runway, they're often coming in very slow. Maybe then, if there are no obstacles, pretty low. Also, they're doing this over obstacles. So they're dragging it in just maybe so that they just clear the obstacles. But they do that simply because they have to do it. Otherwise, they will not be able to land into their really, really short fields. And they simply accept the risk. Yes, this risk is there. So if they have an engine failure on a really short bush landing, they will hit the ground and the obstacles and whatever there is below the airplane. But they're just taking this risk because it's the only way to actually be able to land at those strips. So always ask yourself if you are really, if you really need to accept that risk, that runway is really that short. Okay. Now the second option, or the second scenario actually, is you have some considerable obstacles in your approach path. You can see that in the image right here. So on short final, you need to overfly some trees, rocks, buildings, whatever. Now here it is really important to fly this stabilized constant angle approach at your correct speed. Keep in mind that your actual usable runway distance may be reduced by that, because as you can see in the picture, if you're coming in at that angle, you probably, for example, waste some of the first meters of the runway. So you need to keep that in mind. Again, speed control is very important. Even if you're coming in at a steeper angle, if you have your speed under control, you will still be able to do a short landing. 10 knots overspeed is just exactly the same like a 10 knot tailwind. and you really don't want to have that on a short field landing. But on the other hand, don't get too slow, because if you're approaching, let's say in one Cessna 152, you're already at the back of the power curve, so you will have a lot of induced drag. Nose will be high up, high angle of attack. You will have a high power setting, and if you overdo that and get even slower, then you might get trapped in a situation where you can actually not accelerate anymore with power alone. Your only option then would be to lower the nose to gain some speed, and of course, if you're already very low, that's a hard thing to do. Now, as I've said before, also in this scenario, you could drag it in, like you can see in the image below. But what are you going to do if you have an engine failure? You will definitely hit the ground or the obstacle below you. And it's not really helping you that much, because if you look at that image, you can see the pilot is dragging it in low over the trees. And then, however, he has to pretty much dive down to make the runway. And at this point, he will gain some more speed. So the landing probably won't be much shorter than as if he or she had just made that constant angle stabilized approach in the first place. So to sum up, always fly a nice stabilized approach at a constant angle at the correct speed. That's actually the key to a good short field landing. Also, if the runway is that short, you can use the low drag it in method, but be sure to only use it if it's really necessary, and also if there are no obstacles in the approach path. If you're a bush pilot operating to extreme airstrips, of course it's a different story. But as a normal private pilot, you're probably not going to need this technique really often. Now, what are the common errors with short field landings? Well, first of all, excessive approach speed. Excessive approach speed simply, makes your landing performance calculations obsolete. And as I've said before, even 5 or 10 knots too fast have a huge influence. It really could make the difference if the strip is short enough between being able to land safely or overrunning the runway. Coming in too high often happens when the approach is flown with a too short final, so maybe going on to final too early, still too high. Now you have excess speed. Speed builds up while you try to reduce that altitude, and in the end, on very short final, you end up too fast. So that's something that should be avoided, and if in doubt, just go around. Another common error is to compensate or to correct your glide path deviations too late. So you're getting too low, and then you need to correct with a lot of power. So adjust your glide path early and with small corrections. Also, don't get too slow, as we've discussed just a few seconds ago. Don't use excessive braking. Use braking after touchdown just as required. Maybe you only need little braking if you do a nice approach. So just brake as required and don't lock the wheels while braking. Also, be sure to maintain directional control. It's not only about touching down at the correct spot, it's also about keeping your directional control on landing and during rollout. It's not much use if you touch down at the beginning of the runway, but then veer off to the right or left of it. So in a crosswind, just be sure to adjust accordingly, just as we'll discuss in a crosswind landing lesson actually. All right, so this concludes the briefing about short field landings. I think that's a pretty interesting and challenging maneuver that's really fun to do actually. So let's try that in the airplane. I see you there.